At this point in the debate, I'm supposed to ask a few follow-up questions. So, William Easterly, John McArthur just listed some very specific examples of what he said are very significant successes. Smallpox eradication, 1 million people on antiretrovirals who have HIV, once thought impossible. The UN and others cut measles deaths by 91%. What he said about Malawi, are these not significant successes?
I'm not going to say that everything fails, that there are no successes. Smallpox was a success. But the fact that we keep citing the same thing over and over again suggests just how few successes there have been. The measles success, unfortunately, was, until this new announcement, was actually on the ledger side of failure. A cheap and inexpensive measles vaccination had been available for decades, and yet had not been used to save millions of lives from measles. So I'm not sure I would count that as much of a success at this point.
But is the answer to that, given what has taken place, just to stop aid?
You know, I'm not sure that we're voting tonight on whether to stop aid. I think we're voting on whether the existing aid system has done more harm than good. The existing aid system, I think we're arguing, is ineffective. It has bad political effects in propping up corrupt autocrats. And I think that system does more harm than good. I could imagine other aid systems that would do some good, that could save lives, if aid agencies were held accountable for results, which they are not now, if they were held accountable for failure, which they are not now. But we don't have that system at the present. We're voting on the system we have now, and that's the system that has failed us, unfortunately.
So, Gayle Smith, maybe there is a seed of common ground. Maybe you each agree that the aid system that we have now is not the perfect aid system, that there are successes, that there are failures, and there are things that perhaps all of you could agree on to make things much better. Might that be the case?
Well, I think aid systems can be improved, no question. I think that one of the problems, though, with this argument is that it suggests that none of that is happening. I think there are other successes out there. John didn't mention HIV and AIDS, which I think is significant. And the fact that success in measles is later than it should have been, I don't think, therefore, writes it off as a success. But I think we've also got a problem with terms here, and I think this is a bit too important to be slipshod with. For example, when you talk about $600 billion in aid, that conflates development aid and a lot of aid that was given for reasons having nothing to do with development. Let's not pretend for a minute that the aid the United States gave to Zaire during the Cold War was given for development. Everybody knows it wasn't. So to hold it accountable for achieving development aims,
and
I
the
think it's...
U.S.
Let me finish.
has no
Please
strategic
let me finish.
motives at all
Please
now?
let me finish. My point is that aid was not given for development purposes, and you are judging it on the basis of whether or not it achieved development purposes. I suspect we would agree that the purposes for which it was given were not very good, but I don't think it's right to suggest that money that's given for security reasons should be held to development outcomes. Second, I think you're suggesting that the fact that poverty still exists in epidemic proportions in Africa is because of aid. What about the terms of trade? What about commodity prices? What about war? What about drought? What about governments that may be ineffective? What about colonialism and the Cold War? I think the notion that the fact that poverty still exists in Africa because of aid is way oversimplified. Last, that 2/3 of aid goes to corrupt rulers. The example I used of the commodity exchange in Ethiopia is not aid to the government of Ethiopia. It's a private sector initiative. So I think you need to be careful about suggesting that 2/3 of aid goes to corrupt rulers. Lastly, I think there's a contradiction here that we may want to tease out. I think I heard David say that aid is flawed because it's designed to develop people from afar. But Bill's arguing that aid is flawed because it has not developed people from afar. And I think there's a contradiction there. It's wrong because it aims to develop other people, which, I would actually agree with David that that's not something we can do. But Bill, it seems to me you're suggesting that it's wrong because it has failed to do just that.
David Rieff, if I heard you correctly, you said that it never can be different. I think I heard from William Easterly that it could be different if there were a better aid system. Do you think the whole notion of aid to Africa as a means of improving standards of living is an impossible notion?
Well, what I think is impossible is the notion of aid as the centerpiece of development in Africa. So my view is simply that by making development aid from the outside, whether it's national governments or intergovernmental institutions, the centerpiece of what you're doing means it's always going to fail. And I think that the thing that troubles me about if you like, those arguing against this motion is the follows. I'm obviously somebody who grew up in the 60s, and I remember leftists of my type saying at the time, well, of course, the Soviet Union's no good, and Cuba's no good, and China's no good, and Korea's no good, and Albania's obviously no good. But that's actually existing communism. What there is, there's this wonderful communism that we could somehow create. And I think the lesson, this is a point made by the critic of development, Colin Lays, in his rather famous book, that at a certain point you had to say, even if you're on the left, and I remain on the left, I want to be clear about that, in this call above all others, that at a certain point, people on the left had to admit that this was a lie, that there was not actually existing communism and ideal communism. What actually existed was communism.
Do the successes that you listed equate really to significant successes or exceptions, as William Easterly contends, if some of his other stats are true and 2/3 of aid is gobbled up by corrupt dictators and $600 billion spent, and more or less the standard of living on the continent has not gone up?
I'd like to make a few quick points. First on the trade, just because that's come up. I think it's important to understand that if the so-called Doha trade agreement comes through, the estimates are that Africa might benefit about $1 billion per year. That's mainly an issue of cotton exporters. It's actually not an issue for most of the other commodities, and that's $1 billion, which is quite small when spread across 700 million people.
But wait a minute, David Rieff, is that aid or is that something else, trade?
No, the disagreement is if you're saying that my emphasis on trade, John, is not the Doha round. I mean, if we agree about the Doha round.
Right. I'm just saying that the trade is good, but it's not huge in quantitative terms. To Bill Easterly, I would say, I don't know what you expect to buy for $30 per person. You think, I say a million people, 1.3 million people on antiretrovirals in 5 years, and you say, old story. I say 360,000 kids a year not dying. You say, old story. I say 20 percentage point boost in primary enrollment in barely a decade. You say, old story. I really don't know what you expect to buy for $30 per person. These are practical things. I'm not defending, as I said at the outset, everything that's been done in aid policy. I'm not defending all of the machinery. Professor Easterly and I think, would agree on 9 out of 10 issues, and we have in many instances, on what needs to be done to actually improve the aid system.
Professor Easterly, the 1 million people on AIDS antiretrovirals, no big deal?
No, of course. It's prolonging their lives. That's great. I salute that. But
is that harm or is that good?
That's good. But let's be clear about these. Let's be clear about these numbers. For many African countries, aid is 20% of their GDP. If they had invested
which at $200 per capita is $40.
If they had invested that, then the expectation of the aid advocates was that they would have had economic growth. And that simply is what did not happen. It did not get invested. We did not have growth.